Hello, it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Where Business Environment Reform Meets Green Growth. My name is Benjamin Simmons and I head the Green Growth Knowledge Platform. Launched over 4 years ago, the Green Growth Knowledge Platform was originally established by the Global Green Growth Institute, the OECD, the United Nations Environment Program, and the World Bank. The initiative now represents 60 of the world's largest international organizations and think tanks, and represents the largest community dedicated to sharing and generating green growth knowledge and data. We are delighted to be hosting today's webinar in partnership with the Donor Committee for Enterprise Development. We will have an opportunity in the webinar to hear more about the Donor Committee and their innovative efforts to draw together and catalyze collaboration between governments and institutions. We will also have the opportunity to learn more about some of the challenges and unique opportunities for bridging national efforts focused on business environment reform and those focused on promoting a green economy transition. However, before we get started, I'd like to highlight a few logistical issues. First, we strongly encourage participants to raise questions throughout the webinar. This can be done by typing your question into the chat box, which can be found on the right-hand side of the webinar dashboard. Your questions will be submitted to our technical staff, who will then repost them to all webinar participants for our panelists to address during the Q&A period. After the webinar, we'll be circulating a 5-minute survey. This provides us with valuable feedback that will help shape our future webinars. We kindly request that you take the time to complete it. And of course, if you have any technical issues, please email us at contact@ggkp.org and we will help you troubleshoot. Again, that's contact, C-O-N-T-A-C-T, @ggkp.org. Finally, please note that all of our presentations you see here, as well as a recording of the webinar, will be available on the GGKP website shortly after the webinar. And so we encourage you to visit that and share that link with your colleagues. Now, without further delay, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today's webinar, Tim Scott. Tim is a policy advisor and program manager on inclusive green economy at the United Nations Development Program. Tim has many years of experience with the United Nations, the public sector, and civil society, working on the intersection between environmental sustainability, economic progress, and economic growth and social progress. And closer to home, Tim has been an extremely active partner in the Green Growth Knowledge Platform over the years and a champion and leader of institutional collaboration. So Tim, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you to today's webinar. It is my great pleasure to turn the webinar over to you. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks so much, Ben, for that good introduction and those kind words. On behalf of all partners and speakers today, let me also welcome everyone to this special joint DCED and GGKP webinar on business environment and green growth. We're all in different time zones, so good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Here in New York, it's morning, and just before I jump into things, I wanted to show you the view from our window and in New York, but nonetheless, we're committed to advancing conversations such as these on green growth. So today's discussion is on business environment reform and green growth, which are two distinct policy domains with their own objectives and implementation strategies. When and how do they intersect? How to promote synergies and address trade-offs between these two domains in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals? What can policymakers and practitioners learn from these two fields? How can they learn from one another? In a recent report from the Donor Committee for Enterprise Development, these types of questions were answered. The report shared many practical options for designing integrated programs where business environment reform and green growth objectives are advanced together. So during our webinar today, we'll hear more about these integrated options from our 3 expert panelists, and after their presentations, we'll open up the floor for questions. But again, as Ben said, you're welcome to share written questions throughout the webinar, which we'll be monitoring. So first, let me introduce Matthias Pluk, who is a senior consultant at Technopolis Group, which is a policy-oriented research and consulting house. He's worked on a range of development projects in Europe and for international organizations such as the EC, UNESCO, OECD, GIZ, African Development Bank, and he's led major international studies and policy evaluations, including the report, which is the focus of our webinar today. In a few moments, Matthias will start us off by providing an overview of the findings from the report, but first let me introduce our remaining speakers. Our second expert who will speak today is Tapera Muzera, who has been leading, executing, motivating, and inspiring others for nearly 20 years as a chief technical advisor responsible for implementing the ILO's Decent Work Country programs. He currently serves as an advisor for a CTO for an ILO CETA-funded project on promoting decent work in Rwanda's informal economy. He's also an experienced trainer and author and an executive member of McKinsey Global Institutional Research. Tapera will be sharing with us later a case study on the Zambia Green Jobs Program. Now, our third expert today is Justina Grosjean, who is project manager at GIZ in Vietnam, where she specializes in macroeconomic reform processes for green growth, including green fiscal policies and green finance mechanisms. Justina has also worked to advance sustainable development through assignments with GIZ in Berlin and Hanoi, the German Federal Foreign Office, the delegation of the European Union to China, and the UN Regional Economic Commission for Europe in Geneva. And later today, Justina will be sharing with us a case study on the GIZ Macroeconomic Commission for Europe in Geneva. So as you can see, we're very lucky to have such a strong panel lined up for today's webinar. And before we begin with Matthias and his overview of the Business, Environment, Reform, and Green Growth Report, let me first now also introduce Nick Wilson. Nick Wilson is Assistant Coordinator of the Secretariat for the Donor Committee for Enterprise Development Secretariat, or the DCED for short. So Nick, let me now turn the floor over to you for a short introduction on the work of the DCED.
Thanks so much, Tim. Yeah, I'm just going to try and speed through this so we can get to the really exciting material that we have on offer from Matthias and the other experts on the panel. So just to give a really brief introduction to the DCED, the Donor Committee for Enterprise Development has been going for about 40 years now. And it's a group of 22, currently 22, although growing all the time, different governments and donor agencies and intergovernmental organization who kind of share the vision of kind of producing economic opportunity for the poor through the private sector, and about learning from experience and sharing best practice in this area. So yeah, I'd say the 3 points of the shared vision, as shown on the slide, are kind of sharing experience between agencies and field programs, disseminating knowledge and guidance on good practice in PSD, and communicating evidence on results in PSD. We kind of maintain several databases, for instance, on value chain development and business environment reform, as well as other kind of knowledge pages on our website, which is enterprise-development.org, or if you just Google Donor Committee for Enterprise Development, I'm sure it'll be the top result. Yeah, we're always interested in hearing about new knowledge projects on kind of achieving developmental goals through and with the private sector. We like to share resources from other agencies and other organizations. For instance, the Green Growth Knowledge Platform, we've been very interested to share some of their resources, and we'll obviously continue to do so. Currently, we have kind of 6 working groups, which consists of representatives from member agencies who gather to kind of share knowledge on specific areas. Those 6 areas are private sector engagement, women's economic empowerment, market systems, results measurement, business environment reform, and green growth. Obviously, the last of those two, the last 2 of those 6 groups concern us today. This work item began as a kind of joint project between the Business Environment Reform Working Group and the Green Growth Working Group. Just to give a little bit more detail on the Green Growth Working Group, the Green Growth Working Group has been going for just almost 10 years now. Its kind of overall aim is to kind of mainstream green and inclusive growth strategies in private sector development within kind of member agencies and beyond. And I think that, yeah, this is a fantastic, this publication under discussion today is a fantastic opportunity to achieve that goal. We kind of have regular working group meetings where we kind of exchange between member agency. And if you are a suitable agency, please do get in touch if you'd like to be a part of that. Alexandra Opperman, who I believe is listening in from GIZ, is currently the chair of that working group. And I believe her contact information is available on the Green Growth Knowledge platform. So I think I'll leave it there, Tim, and hand it back to you.
Thanks so much, Nick, for sharing that great introduction about the work that the DCED does, including the work of the Green Growth Working Group. It's thanks to the DCED and the Green Growth Working Group that we have been able to produce the report looking at synergies between business environment reform and green growth, which is the topic of our first presentation. I'd like now to turn the floor over to Matthias, who will be presenting and providing an overview for us on the webinar's main theme, the search for synergy, business environment reform, and green growth. Over to you, Matthias.
Okay. Thank you so much, Tim, for that kind introduction, and thanks to GGKP for hosting this very interesting webinar. It's really an honor to present here on these, present the lessons, let's say, from this journey that the DCED has undertaken for the past couple of years. And I hope this will be an interesting sort of introduction to the discussions today. I think we have all the extremes in climate here. I'm here in Abidjan. It's actually 40 degrees Celsius outside, so I think we're truly this is truly a global webinar in many ways. So yeah, let me just get right started. So as you can see, my name is Matthias Ploeg at Technopolis. This project was done with a big team actually of several colleagues and also other institutes such as TU Berlin and the Wuppertal Institute and University College London. But I have the honor to present today. It started actually already quite a while ago in 2015 when the two working groups of the Donor Committee of Enterprise Development, the working group of Green Growth and the working group of Business Environment Reform, sort of got together and had the observation that probably they should talk more with each other and they should work more together with each other, because there is probably a lot of overlap in terms of their objectives, and there could be more room for synergy between the activities of these two different policy fields. So when we started with the two working group, we tried to set out sort of a roadmap of how we could facilitate that process of learning, and that's why we came up with 4 steps actually to facilitate that learning. And we started with the first step, which was basically understanding each other. It might sound trivial, but we'll see that actually it was quite a challenge, and we managed to produce sort of a simple methodological framework that helps both areas to understand each other in a better way. Secondly, we wanted to learn from practice to see what's already been done by various donors and other actors in the field, learn from the members themselves, their own programs, and share their lessons learned, but also best practices, of course. The Donor Committee of Enterprise Development really is supposed to be a forum where, you know, both successes but also, let's say, failures can be shared in order to promote learning. How we did that was to actually, we first developed a long list of 60 programs that would be sort of relevant for the intersections between business environment reform and green growth, and we did a policy trend analysis. And secondly, we did then sort of mini case studies of 17 programs and 6 in-depth case studies of programs that were particularly interesting, and there was also particular backing from the members in the working group. You can actually find these in-depth case studies online on the website, which Nicholas just introduced. The link will also be at the end of this presentation. Based on those lessons learned, we tried to come up with a simple tool to help policymakers, but also development professionals to have a sort of quick guide into how to identify potential for synergy and also trade-offs. And finally, we wanted to support action. So the findings and these tools were all combined into a guide with a really a step-by-step approach at the end of the guide, which will really hopefully also help policymakers and development professionals to think about these interactions between these two fields in a sort of easy way. So actually, we've heard the word report many times. We'd like to think of it as a guide, which would sound less sort of researchy or academic, even though it was based on a lot of research. But we'd like to see it as a practical guide for policymakers and development professionals. So the first step was understanding. And this, it might seem trivial that, of course, everybody knows what green growth is, and everybody knows maybe what business environment is. But actually, if you delve into it, you will find that there are many definitions, and that these definitions are generally also even used inconsistently. So that's actually one of the major challenges we found for those two areas to work together, is that there's a lot of unclarity about what we are really talking about. And of course, one of the key changes in the last 10 years probably has been this whole emergence of this green growth domain, which actually incorporates, of course, both these sort of environmental and social considerations as well as the economic considerations. So you would say, well, we actually already have the solution. We have green growth, so why worry about trade-offs between business and environment or social aspects? But we actually found that while this is probably useful in a sort of a policy communication aspect and in sort of an ambition aspect, it can also make it a little bit like a black box. It sounds good, green growth, everybody wants it, but what does it actually mean? And how can we actually in practice promote the synergy between business interests through business environment reform and also environmental and social considerations? So we decided to actually split up these two areas into three main policy objectives, because we tried several ways of how can we scope and map these two concepts. I mean, there are many different ways to do it, but we decided to go for a sort of policy outcome approach, which was the most sort of generalizable across programs, because if you look at specific instruments, for instance, a value chain transformation project, well, is that for environmental protection, or is it for business environment reform? It could be both, and it was difficult to make sort of a clean-cut separation. So we decided to go for this outcome-based distinction. And for green growth, we distinguish between three main objectives, which is pollution reduction, protection of natural resources, decreased resource and carbon intensity. Of course, these are very broad terms, but they generally capture, let's say, 90% of the objectives, of the environmental objectives that are generally present in green growth programs. For business environment reform, we also picked three, which is the reducing business costs. Think about, for instance, the World Bank's doing business scores, etc. Licensing reform, these kind of measures. But also reducing business risk, for instance, legal certainty, making sure that the macroeconomic conditions are stable in terms of inflation, for instance. There are many. This captures many different instruments. And finally, also more market reform, creating new markets or more open market, liberalization, etc. These are, let's say, these three together cover about 90% of the goals which are generally pursued in business environment reform projects. So. Moving on, sort of that helped, I think, to start a conversation and also have a more honest conversation in a way that it's not just one objective. There are multiple sub-objectives, and it is a challenge to bring them together or to make sure that they don't hurt each other too much. So then we also looked, well, okay, we have these two domains, and what could they theoretically actually bring to each other? And looking at sort of a review of literature and all kinds of research, we found that, well, actually there's a lot of potential synergy, at least. I mean, this sort of confirmed that the question which we set out to answer by the working groups, that is it, would it be useful to work together more? I mean, the answer was clearly yes, because we found, well, green growth programs, they tend to have a really interesting dynamic, focusing on creating and unlocking new markets. We're talking about clean technology, renewable energy, etc., new players, etc., which is something BER, business environment reform, is really focused often on private sector development, boosting productivity, etc. But they're sometimes less focused on which market should be developed, or focusing more on existing markets. While green growth brings in this more long-term perspective about, you know, what could be the new economy in 10 years, not just the current economy. And this is something that green growth really brings to business environment reform. On the other hand, business environment reform also has some things to bring to the green growth area. I mean, the business environment reform, which really comes out of the field of a more traditional, so private sector development, they have a strong focus on what are real incentives for businesses, and how can a regulation actually also be harmful and counterproductive for firms, not just for firms, but for societies as a whole. So that perspective, the sort of critical perspective also on how regulation should not be used and what the pitfalls can be, that is something which green growth can really learn from. So it's sort of a balance between public and private perspective that would really that showcases that this synergy is really something which would be potentially very useful. So as you remember, the second step basically, when we said, okay, we understand what the two areas are, we understand how they could potentially strengthen each other, we then went to look at current practice. And that's what we did in 2016, 2017 for a bit, to look at those existing programs. We did case studies, reviews, and we found, well, there is actually, if you look at existing programs, there are quite a number of programs that really try to go for this synergy and try to bring this together. And especially with the growth of the green growth narrative, let's say, this is actually still strongly growing. So we identified our long list, for instance, sometime in 2016, and we found a year later actually that we should have already added a lot, which was, it was not possible anymore. But of course, we clearly saw that this is really a strong dynamic at the moment, that many donors, many policymakers, many governments are thinking about how to integrate that. So also in practice, this is coming up. And in what kind of instrument are we talking about? Well, at the macro or mesoeconomic level, there's a lot around fiscal incentive, tax reform, macroeconomic reform. One of the examples today, one of the case studies we did is the Vietnam example, which the later speaker will talk about. There's also about externality taxes, for instance, on carbon dioxide taxes. You talk about licensing, which can be a great area of synergy, tradable permits, for instance, standardization, introducing norm certification, including, for instance, also extended producer responsibility. I mean, these are areas which help businesses with a certain reducing their business risk, giving them more clarity, but also clearly have an advantage for environmental objectives. The property rights, land reform we also found was a major driver where these things come together. Formalization of smallholder farmers, for instance, to combat deforestation is really one of the other sort of win-win examples we found. Trade policy, but also more at the micro and meso level, we found more, let's say, programs and projects that have relevant, that had a high relevance in this nexus. Sectoral transformation agenda or value chain transformation agenda. Another example today, which will be presented, is the Zambia Clean Jobs Program, which is an excellent example of that. Natural resource governance project, managing fish stocks, for instance. Clearly, there's an interest for businesses that fish stocks are well managed, but there's also clearly an environmental dimension, and that's where where clear synergy exists. Cleaner production, good governance. There are many examples, but we did find that actually in practice, the synergies and also trade-offs were really suboptimally considered so far. There were only a few examples worldwide at the time that really in practice brought these two domains together in a really synergistic way. I mean, many programs and projects claimed that they did that. They called themselves a full green growth program, but they didn't actually follow up with with real measures, actual measures in the other domain, and vice versa was the same. Sometimes you had programs which were clearly focused on business environment reform. An example was a mineral sector reform in East Africa, which we studied, and we found, of course, yes, they said we're also engaged in environmental, and it's a real green project, but that was actually implemented by one training, which had nothing to do with the rest of the program. So there was a lot of some sort of empty claims and a bit of greenwashing, but also on the other hand, actually sort of business-friendly washing without real consideration of the real trade-offs. So that was a finding, and why? Of course, we studied also why do we think that's the case, that it actually has happened so sparsely in the past. So, well, one main challenge I think we really found was these different policy language, and it was something we also experienced at the DCED level. These two fields, they speak different languages in a way. They use when they use the word growth, they mean different things. When you talk about reform, they mean different things, and it took actually for many projects, also the successful projects, quite a while to come together in sort of a unified understanding of the two policy objectives. Institutional silos, of course, many organizations have separate departments for these two different domains. Negative stereotypes. I mean, you would think that we're past this, that people see environment or social issues as a cost or a tax on your program, but behind closed doors there is still some of this talk, and to be honest, there is sometimes a trade-off, and it is difficult to publicly acknowledge that, of course, but behind closed doors there is still a strong focus on these trade-offs, and it's just very hard. I mean, that's to be realistic. So conclusion, we found that was basically phase one of our project. It's hard. What do we do? It should be better. Well, let's come up with some tools and guidance for donors, for policymakers, development professionals, how to improve this step by step. So we got to work and we developed some tools, and one of them was this simple matrix, which is sort of a checkbox tool, which policymakers or can use to identify sort of on sort of quick check if they have a specific program with a specific objective, how they could make use of the other areas, so potential synergies, what they should be worried about potential trade-offs, and relevant policy instruments. So, for instance, if you look at this slide, and for instance, you have a program which is focused on the protection of natural resources. Well, you could, for instance, see that, okay, what could my program offer to business environment reform programs? If I reach out to my colleagues, what can I sort of almost offer them that would be of interest in collaboration? Well, you would see, for instance, now we found in our cases that natural capital stock management, that it can create a lot of new markets. I mean, you need sort of certification services, you need tracing system that requires all kinds of support services to do so. There might even be a market in trading quota. That could actually create a new market in itself. Or for reduced business risk, if you are really well engaged, so it's at the top, you would find that sustainable management of natural resources can also reduce the risk to businesses because their inputs are secure, their access to their key inputs. So, but there are also risks. So we also say, well, if you do that, for instance, there's really a risk that if you do these programs, then it may push weakest firms, informal firms, out of business or shift them to illegality. So that's really a risk to think about. So we hope that this tool, which is included in the guide, can help both professionals from business environment reform as those from green growth to have sort of a quick check on what could I think about in terms of synergies with the other area, but also what could be typical trade-offs, risks, and what are maybe instruments to consider in our policy mix. So a second point, it's not really a tool, it's just a reminder we wanted to make, is that this, as we said, this two-way full synergy where everybody wins it's just very difficult, and in practice it will be rare because, of course, it's also sometimes impractical for organizations to focus on 2 objectives at one, or there are just real trade-offs, and policymakers and politicians have to make a choice between 2 objectives or a balance between 2 objectives. So we did not want to give this. There was a bit of this fear among members of the DCED, but also others, that we would be presenting this land of milk and honey where, you know, everybody should go, but which is clearly out of reach for anyone. So we didn't want it to be a mirage. So we thought, let's give sort of a step-by-step approach. So we said, well, there's basically 4 levels of synergy you could aim for. The first is just no awareness. It's basically you're with blinders on, you're moving forward, you don't know what you're doing. I mean, that's clearly, nobody should want that. But so the first sort of acceptable level is where you think about the trade-offs with the other area. This is standard framework conditions type of role. So if you do a big private sector development project, business environment reform, to do an environmental impact assessment would be a sort of first step to ensure that you're doing no undue harm to the other area. That's the first step. And if you're not doing that yet, maybe that's the first good step to start. The second way is sort of more one-way synergy, where you really try to, from your area, try to contribute to the other area without making it an integral objective in your program. And that might be an easier way also for many policymakers and donors to incorporate that and to, again, take a step on that ladder towards full synergy, where you have a program where both objectives really work together and are interlinked, which are difficult programs to run because they require a lot of human capacity, access to knowledge and skills, and a lot of talking in the beginning, especially. So that's why we wanted to present this sort of step-by-step approach, which hopefully presents sort of an ambition level for everybody that is also feasible. So finally, the guide. We said we wanted not just support to understand, learn from the past, and think about opportunities, but also provide support to action, because of course the goal also of the donor committee enterprise development is to, in the end, support better policies, better programs. So we turned this material into a guide, which is online at the link here, but also I think it's shared. It was already shared through the invitation, which has at the back a very practical step-by-step approach in each phase of your program cycle, from design to evaluation, on sort of the questions to think about and the examples to consider. I've included a few recommendations, so these are my final sort of thoughts for now. What's from the guide here? So as we said, I think some of these things I have mentioned already. I mean, be realistic also. It's better to take a first step on this road to synergy than try and go immediately for the full synergy and failing immediately. Secondly, so we think it's always worthwhile to at least identify and consider the synergies and trade-offs. There's no excuse anymore for just ignoring it. And fortunately, we see, basically across the board that people are no longer ignoring this. So that's a good thing. We have these tools to help also do that in a quick way, in an easy way, to do that process. One other recommendation was really, we found from the case studies, it's really important, if you are working together, focus on winning the hearts and minds early in the process, and people have to, really take up a shared language, is also next point, making sure that you have a shared paradigm. If you really want to go for a full synergy, you have to make sure you're speaking the same language and you're going for the same goals, and it's not just 2 departments or 2 organizations doing their own activities and then meeting each other once a year. I mean, it has to be more than that if you want to be truly take that next step. Also, if you are just doing this first level, let's say you want to contribute to the other area, do make it a real objective. Don't just say, yeah, this will also be good for the environment, without creating formal objectives and funding streams and M&E and communication. It might sound obvious, but we've seen it quite a bit. So that was really a recommendation that if you consider it an objective, do also follow up with those steps, because if you don't formulate an objective and monitor and evaluate and communicate, it's very difficult to facilitate the wider learning in this general road to merging the two areas. I think I've spoken long enough. Sure, we'll be discussing further later at the discussion.
Thanks so much, Matthias. You've done an excellent job of opening up the discussion for us and providing that overview of today's focus on synergies between business environment reform and green growth. I thought your presentation resonated very well in many ways, including the overview of the 4 steps, highlighting some of the different case studies, the focus on both macro and micro level policy reforms. It was great the way you framed for us, on the one hand, the green growth agenda, which more or less looks at issues of reducing pollution, protecting natural resources, reducing carbon emissions on the one side, and on the business environment reform side, looking at business costs, business risks, and market reforms. So it was great the way you laid that out for us, and also the checklist, or the different levels of aspiration, and then the practical tools that policymakers can consider depending on their level of aspiration, for looking at not only the synergies but also how to mitigate the risks, the trade-offs associated with this intersection. Now, just before I turn the floor over to our next presenter, Tapera, who will be speaking with us in more detail about a case study from the Zambia Green Jobs Program, I wanted to recognize and encourage everyone who is submitting questions. I just wanted to highlight a few so that our speakers or experts can keep them in mind for their presentations now and later. We've had great questions about how to connect policymakers and business communities, how to integrate social innovation and lifelong learning, how to address constraints, in particular for SMEs, small and medium enterprises, in the green transition, issues around the time span, what are the different implications for short-term versus long-term transitions related to fiscal reform and fuel subsidies, examples from Latin America. These are just some of the good questions that have been coming in. Please do continue to share, and we'll try to pick them up both now in the formal presentations and later. Now, let me turn the floor over to our next presenter. Tapera, we very much look forward to hearing about the case study from Zambia and the Green Jobs Program. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Tim. So my story comes from Lusaka. I'm currently in Lusaka at the moment, and let me start by starting at the top, really, sharing what I think is critical when it comes to business environment reform and where it meets green growth policy. Whereas it's very nice to include issues of green growth and business environment reform in national development plans, the issue really lies within the Ministry of Finance. And in there, together with the Central Statistics Office, you will find national accounts. And these national accounts are very critical when it comes to macroeconomic planning. So really what you want to do is work with Ministry of Finance and look into national accounts and separate the different industries that constitute the economy into what is green and what is not as a baseline. And then it is possible to use national accounts to then develop an employment projection tool, which you can use to then predict or look into what sort of sectors do we have in the economy that have a potential for green growth. So it's very important to be evidence-based when you are making a green growth policy, and to use practical economic planning tools such as employment projection models to really show people and businesses where the potential for green growth lies, and to set achievable targets together with the private sector of what sort of targets can we set ourselves together so we can progressively look at how we are transforming our economy towards a low carbon, greener economy. But that's not all. The other thing that you need to consider is the issue of having a very practical industry policy supported by industry codes, standards, and guidelines. This is very important because having a national policy, having clear targets, a clear direction of where you want to go with the economy in terms of transforming it to a low carbon economy would not be practically sufficient if you don't zero in down to the specific sectors and the specific industries associated with those sectors, and to actually have practical industry policy which is supported by codes, standards, and guidelines, so that the private sector can actually see how to participate, how it can engage, what role it can play in transforming the economy. We found this really very, very important when we were working with the Zambia Green Jobs Program. And the other thing is also, we found it critical to start with low-hanging fruits. Here I'm talking about anchor sectors. For instance, in our case, we looked at green affordable housing, simply because it cuts across a number of things, such as water and sanitation, energy, building materials, processes, services. It gives an opportunity for us to demonstrate why green growth is so important and how it can be achieved. So starting off with an anchor sector allows you to demonstrate quite quickly with a low-hanging fruit that is also impacting on the wider economy. But that wasn't enough. One of the most important lessons in our case is that you need to make a very strong business case for going green. You need to galvanize the demand for private sector participation. And here, what I'm implying is that you need to be very clear what is the demand that warrants commercial interest. Why should the private sector be involved in driving greener growth? And what we did was to analyze, in our case, the building construction sector, and narrow down to the housing where the demand was greatest. And we were actually able to show that if you invest in this, there are potential returns. So it's not about charity, you know, it's not about doing good, it's not about being a good corporate citizen, it's also about business. It's not just that, it's also about business, so that you can begin to see investments and capital flowing into that particular industry, so that the private sector is comfortable to invest in that industry and move on. But then we also saw the importance of sharing the risk with the private sector by walking the talk. So in our case, in affordable housing, we actually took to demonstrations together with the private sector to say, here's how you can do green affordable housing. And if you can replicate this, here's your business model, and this is how you can actually succeed. So if you are to work with the private sector, the message here really is that you should be willing to share the risk. You should be willing to support proof of concept, what they call proof of concept. You should be willing to demonstrate exactly what you mean by going green, and what does that mean in terms of private sector investment. So you need to speak the language of the private sector so that they're also comfortable to discuss with you and to engage and make investments that then drive the industries and the sectors that you would have selected to move forward in terms of greener growth. But in summarizing, I would like also to say that what is important is to look at this thing from a systemic perspective. We had interventions that were driving changes in mindsets, gradually shifting values and perceptions about what does it mean to go green in the building construction sector. This saw us working with universities to change curriculum for architects, for instance, to move over to sustainable agriculture, all the way to working with media to build the market for greener growth by changing the values and perceptions of the customers or the market in terms of players and customers, so that we could also be developing markets for greener growth. So the meta level is also very important, not just the policy level, the macro level that we've been discussing. The other area, of course, is that micro and small enterprises are quite critical in terms of participation along these value chains. So we made a deliberate effort to also support micro and small and medium enterprises along the value chain. Let me just wind down by giving you a link where you could also look at how Zambia is greening its way out of poverty. It's an info story that was done by the ILO, and you can grab a link there and dash there and see some of the things about this program. But these are my key lessons, basically, for this discussion. I would be very happy to take any inputs or questions from the audience. Thanks very much, Tim.
Thanks so much, Dabir. That was a great presentation and a great overview of the innovative work that you've been doing with partners in Zambia. I loved how you framed the initiative by starting with a strong evidence-based, setting realistic targets, working with the national accounts. It was great that in addition to having the national enabling policy environment, you highlighted the need for sector-specific policies or industry-wide policies, including codes and standards that can give the private sector a signal and a clear roadmap for how they can partner with and adjust to and benefit from the green transition in their own specific sectors. I also thought it was great how you talked about low-hanging fruit, but also the need to make a strong business case. As you say, it's not just a charitable approach. It's about helping businesses prosper and shift to a more durable path of growth that's market-driven. The example you gave from the housing sector was very clear, and I love the way you highlighted the need to, or the role for the public sector to support or possibly subsidize demonstration projects that can then be scaled up and taken on board by the private sector. And a final takeaway from your presentation, which I thought was great, was the systematic approach that had you working not only, or had Zambia working not only across the public sector, not only with the business community, but also with universities and also with media. So thanks very much for that presentation. I think you also started to answer some of the questions that we've got on the role or challenges for small and medium enterprises and how to communicate with businesses, or how to facilitate that communication between public and private actors. And perhaps in the Q&A session, we can come back into a bit more detail on the how that was achieved in Zambia. But for now, thanks very much for that. And to our participants online, please keep the questions coming in. We'll try to address them as we go, and particularly in the Q&A. Now let me turn the floor over to Justina. Just to remind, Justina will be talking about macroeconomic reform and green growth program in Vietnam. So the floor is yours, Justina.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you for inviting me to join the panel today on this very relevant topic. And I'm not going to show you snow outside. I'm with you from Hanoi, but I'm going to show you this. I'm not sure you'll see anything. This is basically an application rating and monitoring the air pollution, outside air pollution. So today it's yellow. Even my 3-year-old daughter learns this at school, which is actually a good day. So this is to tell you how green growth matters for Vietnam, one of the examples, although snow probably could have been another one. So my presentation is going to focus, once I figure out how to, yeah, okay, that works. So my presentation is going to focus on green growth and business environment in Vietnam based on a very concrete example of a program I work for. And first I'll begin by starting setting the scene, really, telling you what has been done in terms of green growth policies in Vietnam and the same for the business environment. And then I'm going to briefly outline to you how our program works and bring up a very concrete example of the green financial sector reform that we've been working with the government on since 2014. So, well, green growth in Vietnam is very highly relevant, as I mentioned, due to, for example, air pollution. That's one of the issues, challenges that is really quite urgent at the moment. And there has been a lot of policies, both national and international agendas that have been adopted in Vietnam. Maybe the most important or relevant for our project is the Vietnam Green Growth Strategy that was adopted in 2012. And actually, there was also a Green Growth Action Plan approved in 2014 that have 3 strategic objectives: so carbon growth, greening production, and greening lifestyle. So basically, green consumption. Then we have the implementation of the Paris Agreement with also an action plan approved by the government. And let's say, while the Green Growth Strategy is basically coordinated and in the hands of one ministry, the Ministry of Planning and Investment, of course, in a coordinated effort with all other land ministries, the implementation of the Paris Agreement is mostly coordinated by the Ministry of Environment. And then the third level I wanted to introduce to you here is the plan for the implementation of the Agenda 2030, so the Sustainable Development Goals. It was adopted in May 2017 here, the national plan. And actually, according to the Ministry of Planning and Investment that coordinates the implementation, more than half of Vietnam SDGs targets are related to green growth somehow. So the business environment reform is very high on Vietnam's political agenda as well. Since 2014, there have been actually yearly updates of the so-called Resolution 19 of the Communist Party, so a very highly relevant political document on improving business environment and enhancing competitiveness. And the Vietnam Doing Business indicator of the World Bank improved from 82nd to 68th rank over the past 4 years. So although there were a lot of efforts and actually a lot of achievements over the past years, there are still areas that experience little progress. And to tell you maybe more where our project kind of comes into picture with the 2 agenda, green growth and business environment reform, well, we are working as one of our counterparts in Vietnam with the CIM, Central Institute for Economic Management. And they have asked us for the future phase of the project, of our project, to basically support them in monitoring or in providing inputs for the monitoring of the Resolution 19 on business environment by feeding them in with or feeding the reports with basically where it can be, where the synergies can be leveraged between protecting environment and also pursuing a strong business reform. So this is something that we will be doing in the future, not now, but I will briefly tell you what we are doing and how we are working with CIM right now. Sorry, I think the slides are not moving. Yeah, the program we are implementing on behalf of the German government is basically set up to work with different ministerial partners. Ministry of Planning and Investment is one of them. CM, Central Institute for Economic Management, is another one. And we cover different fields, which is really the strength of the program as I see it. So we are both supporting the implementation of the green growth strategy and the coordination of the implementation, but also providing scientific advisory, supporting the scientific advisory on green growth, providing trainings on green growth for policy makers. We are also working with the Ministry of Finance on green fiscal reform and modernizing public finance. We are also working on supporting green financial sector reform, which is basically the area that I'm going to focus on later on. The additional strength of the program is that it's strongly interlinked with two other ones, which one of them adds the social dimension of green growth policies, and the other, which does not have much to do with green per se, but we are supporting the Office of the Government, so the Office of the Prime Minister, in Vietnam's legislative reforms, and that also helps. And the way I wanted to show you where the BR approaches come into play is that we don't have it as our specific objective in any of our projects, but we still work on approaches of business environment reform. For example, through some activities like impact assessment for reducing tariffs for environmental goods and services within APEC, or introducing the eco-tax. We've also done a policy impact, or still in the process of doing a policy impact assessment for the revision of the labor law in the context of the newly signed CPTPP, so Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership. And yeah, we're also working with the State Bank of Vietnam, so the Central Bank of Vietnam, on introducing financial instruments that would facilitate access to finance, especially for small and medium-sized enterprises in the area of green growth. And this is what I'm going to focus on right now. So since 2014, we've been supporting the State Bank of Vietnam and the State Securities Commission, as well as the stock exchanges of Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City, in green financial market reform, different areas of this. And why is it so important? So, well, according to the estimations of the MPR, the Ministry of Planning, $31 billion investments are going to be needed for all green sectors by 2020. And according to Ministry of Environment's estimations, between 2021 and 2030, we will need more than $21 billion for the implementation of the nationally determined contributions. So we know that in Vietnam, the budget deficit has been over 5% over the past year, so quite high. The public debt is reaching its debt ceiling, the limit that is set yearly by the government at 65%. So public spending has only limited options to cover that need. The official development assistance, of course, plays still a very important role in Vietnam, but both public spending and ODA will not suffice to finance a fully fledged green transformation. So the significant amount will have to be covered through private investment. And this is why the government has a strong motivation and willingness actually to improve the environment for the businesses to invest in the green sectors. And what is it all about, green finance and green banking? How have we been supporting it, and what is the policy framework here? Well, to facilitate it, we have different kind of strategies and policies. We have the ones that I had mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, so green growth strategy, Paris Agreement, but also one of the SDG goals, Vietnam target specific, is also to improve the capacities of the banks with regards to green credit. And we have also a policy framework that is very specific on the development of green capital market and green financial products. So as you can see here, there is a strong willingness of the policymakers to really improve green finance for companies. And we focused on several green financial instruments, like Sustainable Green Index at Ho Chi Minh Stock Exchange, Green Projects Catalog, Green Credit, and Green Bonds. Due to time constraints, I will not cover all of them, although I'd love to, because it's a very interesting topic. So I'll mention or maybe more go into depth with the Green Projects Catalog, because this is really the basis for almost all the other instruments that we are supporting the government to introduce. The Green Projects Catalog, has a very mysterious name, but what it actually is a set of criteria divided into sectors and subsectors that provides technical specifications. And so it really defines, helps commercial banks, for example, to define what a green project can be. So by doing so, the State Bank of Vietnam provided commercial banks with actually a basis of evaluating loan applications with regard to how green they are and which sector and subsector they fit in, and what kind of technical specifications they are in agreement with. And this is very relevant because at the same time we were able to pilot a green credit line for small and medium-sized enterprises. So we would provide, or the commercial banks would provide loans at a very favorable interest rate for SMEs that apply for loan and that their projects qualify according to this catalog for green credit, green loan. It has also been a reference for issuing pilot issuance of green bond in Vũng Tàu City and Ho Chi Minh City. So as you see, it's really helped us not only to kind of get our hands on what is green growth, because it's always, or very often, the private sector in any events we have raises the point, well, we know the green growth strategy of Vietnam, but we don't really know what green growth is still. There is no list. So, well, we tackled that problem in saying, well, there is a list. Of course, it's not comprehensive. It will be extended. Right now, it covers 6 green sectors: renewable energy, energy efficiency, land use, forestry and sustainable waste management, and green agriculture. So it will cover even more, I think 11. And it's going to be upscaled to be used on an even broader base, because as I mentioned, in many workshops we've experienced the same comment that the private sector does not really have the knowledge of what green is, and that's why even if there is access to finance, even if there are financial instruments they could tap on, financial like loans, they would not even know how to formulate their loan proposal so that or loan application so that it classifies as green. So this is how it looks like. It's yeah, it sounds more maybe mysterious as it is than it is. This is our green project catalog, and yeah, I think that will be the example, one of the more concrete examples that I would have from our project. So as I mentioned, the business environment reform is not our explicit objective. However, not only from our side as a donor or as a development cooperation partner, but also, and actually specifically, and even more so right now, we have our counterparts, our government counterparts that request proactively training for private sector, that request basically any initiative that we have linked to green growth, to link it to get the private sector on board, to facilitate the conditions for the companies to operate in the green sectors. And this is why our approaches are present across all of our fields of intervention to some extent. However, of course, the challenge is the understanding. I think Matthias mentioned it to a great extent, the understanding of synergies and trade-offs and the coping mechanisms. This is something that we also could work even more on in our projects to make sure that this understanding is also being transmitted to our counterparts. Although I'm quite sure they're also pretty well aware of this. And the opportunities that maybe we identified recently also for Vietnam are the sustainable development clauses in the free trade agreements, because they open new markets, they create, well, the free trade agreements are going to open new markets, the trade is going to increase, but how to make sure that this all happens while protecting environment and natural resources. So actually looking into the sustainable development clauses of free trade agreements, we found that this might well be another drive in this nexus of business environment reform and green growth or sustainable development in general. So with that, I would like to close my presentation. And if you're interested in any other of our instruments that we introduced for green finance, as the sustainability index or green bonds, I would be more than happy to share those with them during the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Justina, for that excellent presentation. We actually have quite a number of questions coming in, but before we open up in about half an hour remaining in the webinar to go over them, before we turn to the questions, though, let me just reflect briefly on your great presentation. So thanks for providing the overarching framework, the global frameworks of the SDGs and the Paris Agreement, and taking us from that global level of commitment to Vietnam's national green growth strategy and action plan. It was the examples that you gave of work with the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Planning, and the work with the Central Institute for Economic Management. They were a great complement to the country example that we had from that Tapira shared from Zambia, and you really gave us a feeling for the type of enabling environment reforms that countries like Vietnam and others are implementing. It was great that you took us through some of the fiscal reforms, some of the finance reforms, and some of the green banking opportunities that are highlighted in the Green Project Catalog. And it was also great to hear you speak a bit about how this work links to free trade agreements. As I mentioned, we've been getting quite a few number of questions. Thanks so much for our participants. And I think what we're going to do in the next half hour is maybe try to group them into more general questions, perhaps that Matthias, you can help us tackle at first, and then we have some more specific ones that are targeted towards the example provided from Zambia and the example just shared in Vietnam. We also have some requests for examples from other regions in Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as other regions, so please keep that in mind too. I know the report that's been shared has many case studies from different regions. But let's begin then. Marius, I think I'm going to turn to you first with some of the broader questions that have been raised. Our friend Kees van der Rie has highlighted the issue of timescales that cover, the immediate low-hanging fruit across a just transition and the longer-term trade-offs or the longer-term implications that can affect different groups, both positively and less positively. So I'm going to ask you to speak a bit about that, and perhaps also, while you have the floor, we had a good question about options for facilitating communication between the business community and the public sector. So over to you, Matthias, if you would, taking on those first two good questions.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Tim. Yes, I think the time dimension is a very relevant one. In two ways, I would say. I mean, firstly, there is indeed the opportunity, let's say, in terms of implementation, to space out certain intervention across time, and therefore maybe sort of managing the trade-offs in such a way that they are also manageable for the businesses. For instance, if you are indeed reforming a fuel subsidy, and it makes sense to reduce that over time and give businesses time to adapt. So time can be an instrument that helps you and work in your favor. Secondly, I also think that interestingly, if you take a little bit more the long view, so if you in the analysis phase, that actually many of the trade-offs, they disappear in some way, and actually it should point you towards the real solution. If you think about natural resources management, for instance, take the example of fish stocks or forestry. I mean, it's obvious that it's not sustainable in many ways to keep depleting.
Sorry, I think we might have just lost your voice connection there, Matthias. Perhaps while we're waiting for the connection to come back a bit better.
And it might sound as a trade-off, deforestation. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, let me try one more time. So so it can also help in actually in this understanding, in creating this joint understanding, because many of the trade-offs, they are not really there. So if you talk about natural resource management, fish stocks, it seems like a trade-off to limit that in the short run to the firms there, and they might see it as a form of government intervention and bad relations. But of course, if you think about the term, I mean, it's also in their interest. So time can also interface, communicate, sort of framing an intervention is very important. So I think it's very right to say time can play a role in framing that, or for reducing trade-offs and also managing the interventions by that's really context dependent. There have been some good examples, I think, where this really works very well is a sector-based approach or a value chain approach, where it's very clear who the stakeholders are. And I guess Tapera will be able to maybe talk a little bit about that, how that worked in Zambia, which I think is a very interesting case because it had this clear sector approach. So I think it's sort of dependent on the type of intervention, but I would generally say that it's through close stakeholder involvement, starting probably already in the design phase, and allowing people also to voice their criticism and maybe skepticism or fears at an early stage, and talk about it, and making sure that there's a shared understanding. So that's almost the standard lesson, I would say, of course, in any sort of development assistance program, but it is very relevant here as well. Finally, maybe because there was a question, yes, there is a case study for Latin America. There is one deep case study about Costa Rica on payment ecosystem services and forestry. There's also one in the Caribbean on Compete Caribbean program of the Inter-American Development Bank on how their business environment reform tried to incorporate also green aspects. So check out the guides and the case studies online.
Thanks so much, Matthias, for fielding those good questions and referring us to the Latin American and Caribbean studies. Before I turn the floor over to Tapera to talk a bit more about Zambia, I just wanted to highlight there are of course many examples from complementary programs out there, both along the green value chain that Matthias mentioned, for example, work around green commodities. UNDP has a green commodities program. There are many similar programs out there. And also on the fiscal side or the enabling environment side, talking about green financing, there are many initiatives being supported as well, some of which have been highlighted. Others, including the UNDP Biofin program, also provide detailed step-by-step support for assessing and prioritizing and implementing different green finance solutions. So there's a lot of information out there. Let me turn now to Tapera. We have a couple good questions for you that are specific to the Zambia case study. And Sophie Aronson has asked about whether the program has been replicated in other countries, what impact it's already had in terms of job creation, and slightly more broadly, has there been enough time to measure the impact of the program on SME growth and profits? So if you could help us field those questions, that would be great.
Yes, let me start with the replication question. So as you saw from my earlier slide, what we had was we had housing connected to water, connected to energy. So we were working across those three thematic areas all together because they're all connected to housing. And what has happened is that we have replications in energy. For instance, we were localizing the production of solar panels, installation of solar home systems, and their maintenance in low-cost housing. So cutting out the imports, using local materials to assemble solar panels for low-cost housing, that is now being replicated. There's a project actually starting soon, supported by one of the donors here. We also looked at waste management as it is connected to housing. So there's a lot of interest already in country. A number of other projects have already started working in that area. Currently, at least not managed by the ILO, but certainly other partners have come into that. We have other partners also continuing now more broadly with what they call climate smart infrastructure, which is very much building on the possibilities that we were able to demonstrate with affordable housing. And so that is coming up within the country. And then outside the country, of course, we have had within the ILO itself some replication in Zimbabwe, parts of it in Mozambique, etc. So I think we are quite happy that the message in country is growing strongly, but also others outside the country are learning from what we have done and are picking up on this issue. In terms of SMEs, actually this was an objective that we needed. We wanted to create 5,000 jobs. To date, after about 5 years, we've worked with 3,729 SMEs, 36% reporting business income increase, and creating 4,326 jobs to date. So we have a very strong monitoring and evaluation, which also involves monitoring and evaluation officers within some of our partners that continuously monitor the performance of SMEs benefiting from the program. We also provide business development service support and linkages to access to finance as part of the broader aspect of promoting SME growth along this value chain of affordable housing. So I think those are the kind of two questions that I've picked up, team. If there is anything else, I'll be very much happy to answer and share the experience of what we have gone through here in Zambia.
Thanks so much, Tapir. Yeah, I think you responded to those two questions quite well. They also apply to other country contexts, and I think I'm going to ask Justina to respond to a couple similar questions and different ones as they apply to the Vietnam example. Justina, we had questions, some specific ones about whether climate change, for example, was integrated into the Green Project Catalog, and a similar question to Zambia, that is it too early to tell, or what steps are in place to, I think you hit it at this in your presentation, to be able to measure the impact of the green reforms, fiscal, finance, and otherwise that are going on in Vietnam on business, on measures like GDP. So perhaps, Justina, you could come in and reply to those two good questions.
Sure. So first on climate change adaptation, the answer is in the first step, no, it was mostly focused on mitigation. So the sectors covered would be energy efficiency, renewable energy, and so on and so forth. I'm more than happy to share with you the latest version of the catalog for those who are interested. But having said that, we have another initiative by, I think, jointly UNDP, World Bank, on basically having a similar exercise for monitoring, or let's say for assessing, categorizing investments, the public investments, in both adaptation and mitigation. So this is ex post, while our catalog is mostly for ex ante investment decision, which investment can be classified as green. They would focus on ex post monitoring on what investment was, or marking which one was for climate change mitigation or adaptation. But this is not in the final stage as far as I know, so I'm not able to share it with you, unfortunately. For the second question on the impact of the green reforms, it's actually an excellent question. We have been trying since the introduction of the environmental taxation, which we've actually supported in our previous phase of the macroeconomic reforms program. So it was before 2014 and before my time in the project, but we have tried to basically to work with the Ministry of Finance on an impact assessment. So there was one that was done, and what came out of it is that more than 1.5 billion were collected additionally for climate change as a result of environmental taxation, which was not a really very accurate calculation. So that's why we wanted to make another one. But for now, it's not on the agenda, let's say. To conduct that. But having said that, I mean, because there is this budget, public budget debt ceiling, and because the government is trying to find ways to mobilize revenues. For example, the environmental taxation was there were considerations to, for example, rise the tax on gasoline from 3,000 dong to 8,000 dong per liter, which would actually represent 40% of the current price, which is quite a big tax, and it's actually quite a lot compared to the region. But then there was a lot of criticism that well, the government is using environmental taxation not for the purpose of protecting the environment, but on gasoline, not for the protecting of environment, but just for mobilizing resources. So yeah, it's an excellent question about the extent and the impact of the reforms. I think we're not that far yet, because, for example, in terms of the financial market reform, we are just piloting and introducing the instruments, so we cannot talk yet about evaluating their effectiveness. But indeed, it will be interesting in the future to conduct that exercise.
Thanks so much, Justina. I think the question is an important one. It's essential not only to make the initial business case, but also as part of an iterative policy process to make sure that we're looking at evaluation and monitoring so that we can adjust during the course of the transition, and also make changes that better reflect or have a better impact on not only overall economic sustainability, but the bottom line for the companies that we're working with. I think we have time for just one maybe final round of questions and comments. So in a moment, I think I'm going to turn first to Matthias. I wanted to, we've mentioned a couple of complementary programs where some of this learning is taking place. Two more include the Partnership for Action on Green Economy, as well as the Partnership or the Poverty Environment Action for Sustainable Development program, also with a range of similar examples and innovations. We have a question that was raised earlier by Peter Rieger, asking about social innovations and lifelong learning. We've touched a bit on that, but maybe in a moment, Matthias and also to Per and Justina, if you wanted to reflect briefly on that. And then we've also had two more recent questions from Peter Georgiori, asked the question, what do you do to ensure SMEs share your green vision, as opposed to just thinking more about a business as usual scenario of short-term profits? And I think, Matthias, you also touched on this in some of your early replies, but maybe you could field this one. We also had a provocative question from Dean Tashobia, asking about the degree to which, how green are our green products and services. The point being that there is a lot done at the policy level, highlighting the importance of a green transition, of green transformations, of green growth. There is, in many countries, despite good efforts and some results, a gap between stated policy goals and actual changes on the ground, both in terms of reducing environmental footprints and also improving and increasing the durability of economic growth. So maybe that's a question for all of our speakers. I'll stop there and I think turn the floor over to Matthias. Apologies to all if we haven't been able to cover all questions. I see two more that have just come up, talking about pricing of products of green enterprises. How is that done? But let me stop there and first turn to Matthias, and then I'll give the floor to Tapera and Justina, and then we'll round out this webinar. Over to you, Matthias.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, so firstly on the lifelong learning question, social innovation. Yes, I mean, this is essentially, I mean, I've been talking, I think, a lot about learning on many levels, and I think it was definitely a learning journey for many of the, for everybody who participated in this review, and I think also all the members. And I think so. The first question, yes, definitely, it's a lifelong learning project. I think for development professionals, policymakers, but of course not just for them, also for the people involved. I think that links a lot to the earlier questions, like how do you get the enterprises and the private sector really engaged. A lot of that is around framing and being realistic, being open for also sort of skepticism and acknowledging trade-offs. I think that's there's sometimes policy choices have to be made, and they just have to be acknowledged and explained and framed, which is the hopefully that we could contribute a little bit to that with the work we've done. On the sharing the vision and the stated sort of how green are green products and the differences between sort of stated policy and actual policy. And that's, yes, I mean, that's what I think our first part of my presentation was really about this. You know, everything is called green growth nowadays, and what does it really mean? And that was a huge challenge for this project. And what we ended up sort of why we ended up with these outcome related classifications is because basically the only way to really in a realistic way talk about it, and not just in a PR marketing way, is to talk about what are the results in these outcome areas. And that's why I would say monitoring, evaluation, and impact assessment are so important and critical to really know whether a program in each area, how they have impacted their own, but also the other area. So I think it's difficult to just say this sector is green or this product is green. It might be a good first step, and I think, I mean, what we've seen from Zambia is that it can be very useful in framing, bringing people together. Then the next step then is, of course, to measure and to assess the impact, whether this is actually a green sector, a green product, and what have the results have been in terms of emission reductions, in terms of protection of natural resources, decarbonization, etc. So yeah, I really feel that sentiment of that question. So yeah, I think that's it for these questions.
Thanks so much, Matthias. As we come towards the end of this webinar, let me give the floor now first to Tapera and then to Justina. Tapera, any closing thoughts on any of the questions and topics raised already, or something else you'd like to share with us as we come to a close?
Well, Tim, let me just respond to some of the questions that I picked up. One on pricing of green enterprise products. Another one, how do SMEs share the vision on green? What is the adaptation level of SMEs? I think the real issue here is that you have to have a strong business case. SMEs are private sector entities, and they understand the language of profit, and they are willing to look at opportunities to make profit. And if you can make profit the right way by also making profit out of environmental sustainability, then businesses are willing to do that. But make no mistake, profit is not a calculation by mistake, it's an objective. That's why businesses are set up in the first place. And until you satisfy that objective, you are not really saying anything meaningful. And if you want them to be part of that vision, then you have to show where is the profitability in all of this? Why should I invest my personal savings and income in this? And remember, when it comes down to SMEs, you know, savings are key. I mean, capital is scarce, and the priorities are huge. So you have to have a very strong business case for SMEs. So I think that does it for me for those three questions. But there's also another question here around governments really taking this issue very seriously rather than on paperwork. And I think I just want to re-emphasize here that working with the Minister of Finance is really key. If you look at national accounts that normally sit in your central statistics office, you can look at input and output tables, you can look at supply and use tables, and social accounting matrices. These describe very well the industries that are actually contributing to the economy, that are part of the economy. And if you can show, with figures that here is what you can do if you invest, this is the kind of outcome you can expect, especially in terms of job creation. Here in Zambia, what happened is a jobs target was set across a number of policies, from the national development policy all the way down to youth policy and other sectorial policies. There was a specific mention of a jobs target. So that made it easy to now start asking, where are the jobs going to come from? How many jobs, in which sectors, and how are you going to create them? And so we use that opportunity to say, well, there's a way, an economic tool we can develop to actually project where the green jobs are going to come from, and to show which sectors have the greatest potential. So this can actually be done, and it gives perhaps some figurative way, some visual way of people coming together, business and government, and deciding that I think let's try this in this particular sector. I think for me, those are the questions that I kind of sort of picked up, Tim. Otherwise, thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Tapira. I think you covered those questions quite well. Let me now turn to Justina. Justina, if you'd like to respond to these or other questions, and any other final closing remarks that you might have.
First of all, I would like to say that I really agree with Tapira, what he just said on having a business case, very important for the private sector. And another aspect he mentioned about getting the Ministry of Finance on board, fully agree for Vietnam. It is also the case here. Maybe one of the questions I wanted to respond to is lifelong learning, or if that's meant also vocational education and training. This is an aspect we haven't really covered here in today's webinar, but I do think that enhancing businesses to our business environment for green growth also requires the labor force, the workforce that is trained in that sectors. So we don't do it, we don't cover it within our program, but GIZ does some work, and also KfW, on vocational training and education. And I do think that for the next years, in order to train, to prepare the workforce to work in the green sectors, wastewater, renewable energy, to have really reliable production at home, it will play a key role actually. And there's a strong role not only for the policymakers to create enabling conditions for vocational education and training programs and colleges, but also for industry to work with the colleges to train the workforce. And so maybe another point to reflect on in that discussion. And another point, maybe what I also found interesting was someone mentioned media, the role of the media, and how do we actually get SMEs on board? And we actually face that problem or the challenge here in Vietnam. We have a very good outreach with the policymakers at provincial level, at national level. But how do we actually make sure we have this outreach towards the private sector, to the businesses? And this is actually something that is much more challenging. And I think media, working with the media, with maybe universities also, is a good way to having an additional buzz around green. And I fully agree that there is some greenwashing, and everything can be green these days. But I think it also is important to include it in, for example, schools curricula at the very grassroots level, because associating green growth to necessarily huge investments is not always conducive. And sometimes having families using less plastic is already a contribution towards green growth that we can ensure through public raising or awareness raising campaigns. So these are my last points to that discussion. Thank you, Tim.
Great, and thanks so much, Justina. I think we're about to come to a close, unless, I didn't know, Marius, if you wanted to come in with any other thoughts. If you do, let me know. Otherwise, I think we've had a great webinar. We've looked at the links between the two domains of business environment reform and green growth. We've had some great questions and discussions and presentations about how not only to maximize synergies between these two domains, but also how to mitigate some of the trade-offs, particularly those that happen over time for different groups. And we've also had a good discussion on partnerships between the public sector and the business community, as well as with civil society, with media, with universities. So without further ado, let me just, on behalf of UNDP, the GGKP, and the DCED, say a big thank you not only to our speakers, Matthias, Tapira, and Justina, but also to all of our participants today. Thank you so much for joining us and for contributing to this webinar on business environment reform and green growth. And with that, let me wish everyone a good day and goodbye for now.